The Perfect Dictatorship, China in the 21st Century by Stein Ringen, Hong Kong University Press. China is an old state, and the current regime continues in an old tradition. China has seen itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, with others around on a lesser scale. The Chinese regime today is again expecting something of that old deference. But the old claim to being better than others is now grounded in the regime's custodianship of a new model. What makes that model not only different, but also better, is that it is socialist. Everything the regime does is socialist. Their market economy is socialist. Their democracy is socialist. Their laws are socialist. In 2006, in response to concerns over urban-rural disparities in the wake of rapid economic growth, the leaders launched a program of rural reform under the slogan of building a new socialist countryside. The welfare hypothesis is to be taken seriously. There is a strong link between socialist theory and of welfare state theory. There are two theoretical versions of socialism, the communist one of revolution and the social democratic one of gradual reform. The link between socialist theory and welfare state theory is that an ambitious system of social protection is thought of as an instrument in the gradual and social democratic transformation of society towards a socialist order. Since communism is abandoned, since public policies are manifestly reformist, and since current socialist thinking is about gradual transition, what may remain of socialist ideas in the Chinese model might be a version of the social democratic version of socialist theory. Professor Ringen, for example, promotes a theory that might well be described as social democracy with Chinese characteristics. This thinking has recently been prominent in the state's leadership. In 2006 and 2007, the party enshrined the principles of scientific outlook on development in order to build a harmonious society. That could represent a shift in the state's self-presentation from an ideological to a pragmatic mode. A Chinese welfare state would still be a dictatorial state. It is possible that its leaders have genuinely believed that the stability that is grounded in dictatorial control is necessary for growth and for the states to translate growth into adequate social security and public services for the population. The idea of the Chinese party state as a welfare state is therefore not necessarily a fantasy. The adoption of these signals was the work of then Party Secretary Hu Jintao and Premier Wen Jiabao. They had become concerned about the deep divisions of inequality that had emerged during the reform period, about the grievances these divisions created in the population, and about the threat that these schisms might represent to the stability of development and ultimately to the regime itself. Scientific outlook was code language for more political control over market forces, in particular to carry the half of the population living in the countryside along in progress. The harmonious society is obviously a society without disruptive differences, one in which all the people are served by the state's policies and by the growth that these policies have unleashed. Here the leaders were reaching back to classical socialist theory. In all socialist thinking, there is a pre-utopian interim that has to be traversed and in which policies can be unattractive. For example, by wages being held down because of the realization of socialism in the next stage. In this narrative, China is still in its interim. The ground is being cleared for the coming of socialism, and socialism is defined in terms of harmony. The then leaders even committed themselves to a date. They looked 15 years ahead and proclaimed that the harmonious society was to be built by 2020. By then, China should be out of its interim and well into this specialness, which would establish the model as the superior one, not only in economic efficiency, but also in social equality. It was who and when who made harmonious society official party terminology. But the concept and idea sits deeper in the Chinese tradition. At the beginning of the revolutionary period, Mao articulated a vague goal of the Great Harmony, which he again drew from Confucian ideas. The socialist tradition came into it in Mao's view that harmony would be the eventual outcome of a painful interim. The specifically Chinese tradition comes into it from the Confucian idea that it is the state, then the emperor, now the party, that is to be the giver of harmony to all living things. The new leadership as of 2012 to 13 is possibly lifting the People's Republic into a new phase of development. It could be that this new phase is dedicated to the realization of what has been prepared during the preceding interim. This then is a powerful narrative. There is Chinese continuity in it. It conforms to socialist theory, to the idea that something better is to come out of the interim, and that betterment is for the people and not just for the strength of the state. It is supported by theorists and has its own articulation in social thinking. We do not need a precise definition of harmony to know that the Chinese society today is not a harmonious one, and that the absence of harmony neatly captures the strengths of Chinese life and the challenges to the regime. But this does not negate the theory. Socialism means harmony at the outcome of the interim, not harmony during the process. Welfare states are likely to be non-ideological. There is a superstructure of ideas that are guiding a public policy, but that do not have the force of command. They can be ideological. The Swedish state in the period of social democratic dominance was an ideological welfare state that was committed to classical social democratic theory and peaceful transformation of society into socialism. As usual, when state subverts to ideology, this one was led astray into utterly impractical, if ideologically logical, policies. Starting in 1983, it launched itself into the third stage of its democratic transition to socialism by starting to socialize the control over production capital. It did that in so-called wage earners' funds. The ownership of capital was to shift into funds which in theory were to be under democratic wage earner control. That experiment, however, failed spectacularly, both economically and politically, and was abandoned in 1990. The experience changed Swedish social democracy into a non-ideological movement. Sweden has continued to be a welfare state, but is now, like most others, whether under social, democratic, or other rule, a welfare state on pragmatic terms, guided by a vision of promoting the security and well-being of its population without commitment to any more overarching ideology or grand utopian vision. There is something of a contradiction between ideology and welfare, since an ideology state is the custodian of some absolute truth that may easily relegate the well-being of citizens to a second-order concern. Welfare states are obviously activists in domestic public policy. What makes a state a welfare state is a practical administration. In this respect, a welfare state and a trivial state may look much the same. But while they may not differ in being activists, they differ in why and how they are activists. One is activist for its citizens, the other one for itself. They are therefore likely to differ in policy designs. In the trivial states, public policies, however activist, are geared to the generation of legitimacy for the regime. In the welfare states, they are designed for the purpose of giving citizens protection, justice, support, and opportunity. A welfare state is likely to be a confident state that knows what it is about and is safe in the knowledge that its mission is worthy, and one that is therefore predictable and not prone to aventurism either at home or abroad. This was Nelson Mandela's vision for the new South Africa as a rainbow nation, at peace with itself and therefore with the world. Welfare states can, however, be aggressive in international relations. They may succumb to self-righteousness and to promoting themselves with a degree of zealotry. Norway and Sweden, for example, do not have the power to make themselves imperialist nations, but both have used a vision of virtue to promote themselves aggressively for maximum influence on the world stage. Norway as a peacemaker and Sweden for its model as one of unique excellence. A welfare state with power behind it is not necessarily a pretty sight internationally, and the world may well be relieved that Norway and Sweden do not have more power to play with. If China were transforming itself into a welfare state domestically, that would not necessarily make it an unaggressive state internationally. The difficulty with the welfare hypothesis, akin to that of the triviality hypothesis, is that ideas of welfare may not be enough to sustain the party state. A welfare state does not need to be a party state. If the Chinese leaders were to define their state as a welfare state, they would be building a state in which the party has no theoretically justified rationale. It may be there as a historical fact, but is not needed. Welfare ideas offer no ideological justification for party state control. The power hypothesis. Power states are strong states in which the state and its strength are for a higher purpose. They are different from strong, trivial states, where the state is for its own purpose, and there is nothing more to it. They are also different from welfare states in that the purpose is different. Welfare states make it their purpose to work for the good of citizens. In power states, the purpose is given by an official ideology, and citizens are subordinate to the advancement of the ideologically defined purpose. Power states, disregarding brute dictatorships, which in my schema are trivial, are ideological states and party states. The state serves a higher purpose. The purpose is defined by an official ideology. The party is the embodiment of that ideology, and the party state's machinery serves as its guardian. The party is the instrument of the official ideology, and as such the supreme authority. The state is the instrument of the party, and state institutions have a duty to serve the party by force of the ideology that is embodied in it. The citizens, by the same logic, have a duty of obedience and service to a state and party. This is what generates and justifies the ruthlessness which is endemic in power states. When ideology rules, any action that is ideologically correct or productive is justified. It is not strength alone that makes a state a power state, but the way strength is constituted and used. Power states are obviously dictatorial. They are likely to be activists in public policy domestically and may in this respect be similar to trivial states and to welfare states. When trivial and welfare states may or may not be aggressive in international relations, power states are likely to be aggressive. China has the institutional build-up of a power state. It was previously, during the Maoist period, an ideological state. The question now is whether reform and opening up represents a departure whereby China has disestablished itself as a power state and made itself either a trivial state dedicated to its own survival or a welfare state dedicated to the betterment of its people, or whether it is still a power state in a new guise. Many observers believe that reforms and opening up represent a radical departure from the Maoist past and that China is now reformist, liberalizing, moving in a pluralistic civil society direction, and so on. That is possibly the case, hence my two first hypotheses. But although much is changing in China and in the lives of the Chinese, various observations still stand against this optimistic view. 1. Once a state is constituted as a party state, there are facts on the ground that shape its character. There is the double system of control. This is a system that needs and attracts ideology and lends itself to harsh dictatorship rather than benevolent autocracy. State control is justified by obedience to the party. The party would seem to need a set of principles that explain and make sense of why and how it should control the state and society. The idea of a pragmatic, non-ideological, and benevolent party state is something of a contradiction in terms. The party is still the Communist Party. 2. The party is still the Communist Party, and the leaders speak the language of continuity and of society as the hallmark of their model. Those who believe that the party state has been transformed into a pragmatic one tend to dismiss ideological posturing by the leadership as mere rituals and symbolics. Perhaps they are right, but it could also be that the leaders say what they mean and mean what they say. It is usually unwise to dismiss what leaders say about their aims and intentions and outlooks as only tittle-tattle. 3. The term opening up is a bit of a misnomer. Politically, what followed was a reconsolidation of controls. As a result of Mao's excesses, state control had broken down. Deng's reforms did not liberalize China from state control. They re-established a system of control that had been destroyed. 4. The consolidation of party-state control has continued after the post-Deng leadership, and there has in this respect rather been a further tightening than subsequent liberalization. The change in leadership in 2012-13 has brought with it yet further consolidation of party-state control. The new leadership has strengthened the bonds between the political apparatus and the military and consolidated further the alliance between the party and the People's Liberation Army. 6. The leadership has notched up nationalism, militarism, and aggression in language and behavior, both in its propaganda and in its dealing with neighboring countries and more broadly. So the trappings of a power state are still there. The final question is about ideology. Is the strong Chinese state now pragmatic, or is it still or again, in addition to being dictatorial, also ideological? A strong state could still be benevolent. That is not impossible. But a strong state that is also ideological is another matter. All historical experience is that strong ideological states are repressive, ruthless, and dangerous. It could still be prudent and sophisticated in the way it uses strength, but when the chips are down, ideological rules and everything else, such as the common people and their needs, is secondary. The regime was without question ideological under Mao, and the ruling ideology was the revolution. That ideology was discredited and has not been restored. Deng presented himself as the consummate pragmatist, but that was in economic affairs and was in political terms window dressing. He restored the system of party-state control, used it with ruthlessness when necessary, and was the power behind the decision in 1989 to turn the state's guns on the people. His reign was low-key in ideology, but did it represents the end of ideology in China in favor of post-communist regime that is pragmatic as long as it is able to stay in control? Perhaps not. The leaders continue to claim the rights to dictatorial control and do so under ideological authority. The two long and tedious constitutions of the states and of the party are steeped in ideological language. Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the important thought of three represents, and so on. The party's constitution enshrines the four cardinal principles, the ones Deng appealed to as guidelines for reform and opening up, and which include the upholding of the people's democratic dictatorship. It is not easy for party states to give up on ideology, because if it does, it has no justification for its awesome apparatus of control. The leaders continue to speak in ideological language, however vaguely, and it might again be unwise to not think that they mean what they say. If we take the leaders seriously in what they say, as I for one think we should, we have about the following possible storyline. Deng re-established political control, redesigned the rules of economic behavior, and spoke the language of pragmatism. For a while, the rebuilding of states and economy after years of destruction was purpose enough, and there was not much need for further ideological rhetoric. But there is an inherent urge in the party states to cultivate or invent some system of ideas to serve as justification of and giving meaning to dictatorship. Deng's successors inherited a restored and dictatorial party state, but also an ideological vacuum. His mission of salvaging the regime from destruction was accomplished, but he had not articulated a new narrative of purpose beyond growth and prosperity. The new leaders, as custodian of dictatorship in more normal circumstances, again felt the need to justify themselves in more than managerial terms. A party state without an acknowledged higher purpose has a problem with its identity. And once Deng's reconstitution was done, that problem became acute. When economic growth on its own ceased to be justification enough, the leaders again took to ideas, possibly to ideology, to fill the regime's vacuum of identity and purpose. A first attempt was to justify the party state in a vision of a harmonious society. That attempt, however, failed. The idea of a welfare state was too distant from Chinese reality. It failed to take hold in popular imagination. It failed to square with the reality of economic worthlessness and widening inequalities. It lacked the ideological force to provide rationalization of party state control. The leaders failed to reconcile the ideas they spoke of with the realities of their policies. One reason why many observers are skeptical when Chinese leaders rehearse any kind of ideological vision may be that this first attempt at ideological restructuring proved to be pretty much empty talk. Then came the change of leadership in 2012-13. The new leader, Xi Jinping, initially concentrated on getting a grip on the reins of power, something he achieved with impressive determination and speed. He then turned to reform on a broad agenda and to speaking about the direction and purpose of his rule in high language. He praised the People's Liberation Army as the bastion of state power. He spoke out about the need for better discipline within the party state and for the fortification of the order of state control. He launched initiatives to streamline and legalize the administrative apparatus of the state. He lectured officials high and low to lead by example and to shun bad and extravagant behavior. He clamped down on corruption within the system, and he dressed up his initiatives, administrative maneuvers, and repressions in a new super message under a new slogan, that of the China Dream. One interpretation of China Dream is to see it as a second attempt at ideological renewal after the failings of harmonious society. The party state is there. It is as controlling as ever, or more so, in its justification. China has been advancing economically for a long time. There is a need to explain what it is advancing for. It is entering a period of more normal economic development and will no longer be able to rely as strongly as it has on economic growth for legitimacy. The regime is asserting itself internationally and needs a storyline to explain itself. There is a need to justify the continuation of dictatorship. That justification needs to be found in a narrative that is attractive to Chinese people and reasonably aligned with historical traditions and current state practices. In the China Dream, then, the party state is finding or trying to find a narrative of ideas to justify its rule. If this interpretation is valid, Two further questions present themselves. Is the China dream enough of a belief system to establish itself as ideology? And if so, what kind of ideology is it? But these questions I leave hanging for now, to be returned to towards the end of the book. Testing. We have three hypotheses. The triviality hypothesis. The state is for itself only. The welfare hypothesis. The state is for the good of the common people. And the power hypothesis. The state is for an ideological mission. All are plausible and none can be dismissed out of hand. The hypotheses are alternative to each other and testable. Although real cases never fit perfectly to theoretical models, a state like the Chinese one must conform or be in the process of conforming most closely to one of these hypotheses and cannot conform to more than one. The givens apply. The Chinese state, of whatever kind it is strong, dictatorial, and constituted as a party state. Of whatever kind it is likely to be activist in domestic public policy and may or may not be aggressive in international relations. We may think, perhaps, the welfare hypothesis to be the good hypothesis, but a Chinese welfare state might well be an aggressive state. A testing of the hypotheses up against each other would proceed in two steps. The first test is of the welfare hypothesis. If the Chinese state were confirmed as a welfare state, that would both secure the second hypothesis and dismiss the two other ones. A welfare state is neither a trivial state nor a power state. This puts the welfare hypothesis at the core of the analysis to follow. No alternative interpretation is credible unless the benevolent one has been disproved. The welfare test rests on the structure of public policy, on the way the state gives and takes. A welfare state does not depend much on ideology. There will be an idea about security, opportunity, and better living conditions for the people, but otherwise this state stands or falls on its giving and taking. A state that is dedicated to the cause of the common people and whose policies are in conformity with that intention is a welfare state. That again will depend as a first step, the narrow test, on the structure of social protection, on whether social policies are designed for social justice or merely as instruments for the purchase of regime legitimacy. Then it depends, as a next step, the broad test, on the shape of the wider state system within which social protections are embedded, on whether the state in its totality is dedicated to the good of its people. A state that subjugates the common people cannot make itself a welfare state by bribing them with social protection. The second test is in ideology. If the welfare hypothesis were disproved, the two other hypotheses would be viable. What distinguishes these two hypotheses in turn is ideology. If the state is ideological, it is not trivial. It is then for something beyond its own self-preservation. By ideology, to repeat, I mean not just that leaders pay lip service to some ideological notion, such as socialists with Chinese characteristics, but that there is an articulated belief system which is absorbed in the party state and which the leaders sees as binding on themselves and the advancement of which they take to be their ultimate purpose and justification. If the state is in its meaning ideological, it is a power state. If it is not, and is not a welfare state, it is a trivial state. This in turn will come down to the meaning of Xi Jinping's China dream. Is that just loose talk, or does it represent the state's ideological rejuvenation?